Last Train to Nowhere. Episode 4. Mia's hand hovered over the door handle, her pulse quickening as the cold air from inside the building seeped through the crack. The others stood behind her, their faces pale, fear etched into every line of their expressions. The eyeless figure still stood in the fog, pointing silently toward the door. There was no going back now. With a deep breath, Mia pushed the door open. The darkness inside swallowed them whole. The moment they stepped through, the air changed. It felt thicker, heavier, like walking through water. The fog outside seemed to have seeped into the building itself, twisting the space in impossible ways. The walls stretched and bent, and soon the group was separated, each drawn into different rooms. Mia blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the eerie building. She was in an apartment, a small, dimly lit space that felt all too familiar. Her heart sank. The creaky couch, the faded curtains, the lingering smell of cigarettes. She knew this place. She had lived here years ago. The apartment she had shared with Chris. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But everything around her screamed otherwise. The walls, the furniture, even the worn blanket thrown haphazardly on the couch. It was as if she had stepped back in time. The only thing missing was Chris himself. Mia? A voice echoed from the hallway. Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Chris. His figure was blurry, like a shadow barely tethered to reality, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the same dark intensity she remembered. "You thought you could leave me," he said, his voice low and menacing. Mia's hands trembled as she backed away. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but it felt real. Mia's legs felt like lead as Chris stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. His presence was suffocating, just like it had been before. The fear she thought she'd left behind all those years ago came rushing back, freezing her in place. "You never really left, Mia," Chris whispered, his voice a mockery of the affection he once feigned. "I'm still with you, aren't I? Always. Watching, always waiting." Mia's pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled back, her body colliding with the wall behind her. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls growing tighter, the air colder. Chris took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator preparing to strike. "I did leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't control me anymore." Chris chuckled, the sound low and chilling. "You think you're free? You think running away changed anything?" "I'm always in your head, Mia. You'll never get rid of me." Mia's breath hitched, her mind racing. The years she'd spent running, trying to escape the toxic grip he had on her life, it had all felt so futile. Even now, standing in this twisted version of the past, she could feel the old helplessness creeping back in. But something shifted inside her. She wasn't the same woman who had once cowered under his gaze. She had survived. She had gotten out. And no matter what this place was trying to make her believe, Chris wasn't here. Not really. Mia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You don't get to haunt me anymore." She pushed away from the wall, her fear slowly transforming into something else, resolve. She had spent years letting this shadow of a man control her, even after he was out of her life. But no more. "You're nothing," Mia spat, stepping toward the apparition of Chris. "You never had power over me. I gave it to you, but I'm taking it back." Chris's form wavered, flickering like a candle about to be snuffed out. For the first time, a hint of uncertainty crossed his face, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. Jason staggered through the darkened hallways, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The building around him seemed to twist and warp with every step he took, the walls narrowing, closing in. He could feel it, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical force. His heart raced as he turned a corner and found himself standing in a small convenience store. It was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. He knew this place. His stomach churned as the memories came flooding back. The robbery, the moment everything had gone wrong. Jason turned, and there he was, his younger self, standing in front of the counter, a gun in his hand, his face twisted with fear and anger. The Jason from the past was yelling, his voice raw and panicked. The store clerk, a young man barely out of his teens, stood frozen in place, his hands raised in surrender. Jason wanted to scream, to stop what he knew was coming next. But he couldn't. He was trapped, a silent observer in his own nightmare. The younger version of himself shouted again, demanding money. The clerk moved too slowly, and panic flared in the younger Jason's eyes. He raised the gun. "No," Jason whispered, his voice shaking. "Don't." But the scene played out just as it had years ago. The gun fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the small store, deafening in its finality. The clerk crumpled to the ground. Jason's heart pounded as he watched his younger self flee the store, disappearing into the shadows. He stood there, frozen, staring at the blood-stained floor, the weight of his guilt crushing him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though no one was there to hear him. "I'm so sorry." The scene faded, and Jason was left alone in the dark, the memory still fresh, the guilt still suffocating. Evelyn found herself in a room that she hadn't seen in years, but it was as familiar as the back of her hand. It was Mark's room, her son's room. The walls were lined with posters of bands he used to listen to, the bed neatly made, though she knew it had been far messier when he was alive. Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. It was just like the last time she had seen it. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the locket around her neck. The locket Mark had given her, the one she wore every day since his death. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. But then she heard it. "Mom?" Evelyn's breath hitched. She opened her eyes, her gaze darting around the room. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mom, I need you." The voice was coming from somewhere beyond the room, faint but unmistakable. It was Mark's voice, just as she remembered it, soft, vulnerable, and full of a pain she hadn't been able to heal. "I'm coming," she called out, rushing toward the sound. She threw open the door to his room, expecting to see him standing there, alive, waiting for her. But the hallway beyond was empty, dark, and cold. "Mark," she called again, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" The only response was silence. Evelyn's knees buckled as she collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She had failed him. She hadn't been there when he needed her most. And now he was gone, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. She clutched the locket tighter, her sobs echoing through the empty hallway. The group slowly reconvened in the center of the building, their faces pale and haunted by the things they had seen. Jason's hands were shaking, and he couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's gaze. Evelyn's eyes were red, her tear-streaked face betraying the depths of her grief. Mia was the only one who seemed to have regained some sense of control, though her face was still lined with the weight of what she had confronted. They stood in silence for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere of the building pressing down on them. "We need to get out of here," Grace said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "This place, it's not right." Liam nodded, though his movements were stiff and mechanical. "It's feeding on us, on our memories, our guilt." Mia looked around, her gaze landing on a small pile of papers that had been scattered across the floor. She knelt down, picking up one of the yellowed documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the faded text. "These are records," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "of people who were here before us." The others gathered around her, their eyes scanning the pages. The documents were old, filled with names, dates, and strange symbols, but one thing was clear: the people who had come to this place before them hadn't all escaped. Some had disappeared. Some had become something else. "The faceless ones," Jason muttered, his voice barely audible. Mia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They were people, just like us, people who couldn't escape. Evelyn's hands trembled as she stared down at the papers. "What happened to them?" she whispered. "They were consumed by this place," Liam said quietly, "by their own guilt." The group stared at the documents in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. Mia's hands shook as she let the paper fall back to the ground. The faceless figures, they were people. People who had been trapped here, consumed by their own failures, their regrets. Was that what was waiting for them? Suddenly, a sound pierced the stillness, the low, mournful wail of a train whistle echoing through the fog. The group spun toward the door, their hearts racing. Mia rushed forward, throwing the door open. The fog outside was thick, swirling like smoke, but through the haze they could see it. The train, slowly pulling into the station, its headlights cutting through the mist. But something was wrong. As the train approached, they could see figures standing on the platform. Dark, shadowy figures. Faceless figures. "They're waiting for us," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a hiss. The faceless figures stood in silent rows, watching, waiting. The group stood frozen, their minds racing. Was this their chance to leave? Or was it something far worse? Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The train's open doors beckoned them, but the presence of the faceless figures filled her with dread. "What do we do?" Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia stared at the train, her mind racing. This was their chance. But the figures on the platform, what if they weren't supposed to leave? She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the door, and then, with a single step, she crossed the threshold. The train doors slid shut behind her, and the others stood frozen on the platform, their fates hanging in the balance.
This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel and check out our other stories. You can find the link to the next episode in the description below. What do you think about this episode? Let us know in the comment section below.